This video is the ultimate beginner's guide for any beginner fish keeper. If you're beginning your own tank yourself, or you're setting up a tank for a loved one, if you're a parent setting up a fish tank for a child, this is going to be a video that's going to explain pretty much the whole process and how you can set yourself up for success. Fish keeping does not have to be some stressful childhood trauma of losing your first pet. It can be something that creates precious memories that you and your children and loved ones, or even yourself, will hold on to for the rest of your life. It's actually quite a simple process, and I'm going to be breaking it down for you step by step. The first thing you're going to want to do is figure out what interests you. There's all sorts of different fish in this hobby, all sorts of different tanks, saltwater, freshwater, but I'm going to be mainly focusing on freshwater and more so just kind of the standard community tank setup compared to something more specialized like a cichlid setup, because there is lots of different aspects that come with that might be different than a traditional community tank. Just this is going to be pretty simple beginner's guide, like just keeping your standard schooling fish, some bottom dwellers, pretty much stock standard. Like when you think of freshwater, this is what you're going to think of. The first thing you're going to want to figure out before you even think about what fish you're going to want is what tank size you can afford or you're comfortable with, because that's going to heavily dictate what your options are as far as fish go. I think a good starting point for tank size is either a 5 or 10 gallon, because they're relatively cheap and small, so they're not going to take up a whole bunch of space. They can easily fit on a cabinet or a table that's sturdy enough to hold the weight. And that opens up a lot of options for small schools of fish or stuff like betas and even some species of cichlid. Not only do those tank sizes open up a lot of options for you, they also are much easier to manage compared to larger tanks like a 20 or 40 gallon to start out with. Now that we've selected a tank, we need to figure out what other equipment you're going to need. Typically, most fish are going to require a heater, other than some cold water fish like minnows and goldfish, but we're going to say that you're going to need a heater for this video. You're also going to need a filter and a light, and that's about as far as it goes as like necessary equipment that pretty much every tank is going to require in some shape or form. Now, there are lots of options when it comes to these. Typically, I like to use sponge filters for tanks that are more so just for keeping the fish healthy and safe compared to looks, which are how my tank is, my 36 gallon is currently. But canister filters are also an option. But for these smaller tanks, I would either stick to a sponge filter, like I said, and there are some hang-on bag filters. I personally don't have a lot of experience with hang-on bag filters, but I have seen some options, and I know they have some filter cartridges that can tend to go bad, or fish can get stuck in there. So I would typically stick to a sponge filter. If you're not super worried about the way they look, you will need to also buy some airline tubing and an air pump, but they're super easy to clean, almost no maintenance is required. They're super fish safe. I've never had any problems with any fish getting harmed with any kind of sponge filter, which I cannot say about other kinds of filters, such as canister filters, where fish can be harmed by them, or you need to take some extra steps like putting a sponge over the intake pump for the canister filter. But in the case of sponge filters, you can pretty much go throw them in, let them cycle, and then they're good to go. Once you have your substrate down, you're going to start looking at stuff that people in the aquarium hobby call hardscape. This refers to rocks, driftwood, any kind of artificial decorations. And I would typically steer clear away from artificial decorations, just because they end up causing a lot of issues. Fish can get easily hurt on them, or they can potentially break down into the water and harm the fish. If you look on like any kind of forum, you'll see plenty of people that have artificial stuff in their tanks. Stuff like, oh, my fish got its head stuck inside of the artificial pineapple house or whatever. I would just typically steer clear away from them entirely. I would pretty much say, look at nature. Anything you can't find in nature probably shouldn't be in your tank, other than the filter and stuff that you actually need to keep the fish alive. I would just typically steer clear away from that stuff. But if you find a piece you really do like, there's nothing wrong with putting it in there. Just keep an eye on it and make sure it doesn't break down or harms the fish or anything. And be aware that they can also hold on to a lot of waste. So you may need to just kind of pick them up and splash them around in the water every once in a while, so that waste can get picked up by a filter. So now has come the time where you can actually put water in the tank. You have all of your substrate and hardscape down. You can use, there's plenty of tools available. I typically like to use, it's kind of like a pump drain thing that is just really easy. You stick it in the bucket. I'll put a picture of it up on screen, and I'll probably put a link to it in the description. It's really simple to use.
I forgot to mention this in the video itself, but you will need to add some kind of dechlorinator before adding any live plants or any beneficial bacteria into your tank. Anyway, subscribe, I guess.
Now is a good time to start adding plants. There are different types of plants that need different conditions to thrive. I don't remember the exact name, but there are types of plants that you need to attach to hardscape. Mainly Java fern and Anubias. They have a thing that's called a rhizome, which is kind of like this big chunky bit that the leaves are attached to, and you're going to want to attach that to the hardscape without gluing any of the roots to it, because if you put those into the substrate, they'll begin to rot. As long as the if the rhizome is covered, it'll start to rot. There are other plants that you can put straight into the substrate, and in time their roots will reach that nutrient layer and begin to feed and get some explosive growth. There's also floating plants which float on the surface of the water. They are a huge lifesaver. They will save you a bunch of maintenance. I would just completely avoid duckweed because it'll come to haunt you later on. It just multiplies so much, it gets everywhere, it'll spread everywhere. It's just not a good time. I really like red root floaters because they don't have they don't multiply too fast, but they also just help you keep that bio load down within the tank. I would also avoid Salvinia minima because it has these kind of like little, it almost looks like Velcro on the top, and I find that's really prone to getting like kinds of mold on it, and it didn't look very good compared to red root floaters, which almost look like miniature lily pads. So those are kind of like your main categories of plant. Just make sure you do your research, figure out which ones need to be on hardscape, which ones need to be on substrate. House plants. Certain house plants like Plothos or peace lily can also be really good. When I had goldfish, I always had a Plothos in the tank, and that helped manage the waste and everything from the goldfish, because goldfish are massive waste producers. I would pretty much steer clear of goldfish entirely just as a beginner. Now comes the boring part. Now that you have the substrate, hardscape, and plants into the tank, you need to give the tank time to cycle. And you can kickstart this cycle by adding some nitrifying bacteria into the tank. This is normally purchased as API Quick Start, which is a little bottle. I'll put a picture up of it on screen, and you pretty much add that into your tank. The dosage depends on how large your tank is, and that contains that bacteria, which will colonize all the sand, substrate, hardscape, and your filter, and that's what makes the water safe for your fish. I have another video as a short which goes more in depth to this cycle, but pretty much it takes your fish waste and turns it into something that can be processed by plants in the filter, or not by the filter. They can be processed by plants or taken out via a water change. I'll go into water changes a little bit later because there is a lot of controversy surrounding water changes and if they're needed, if they're not, but I will go more so into that into a later section. So anyway, the basics of this cycle are you put in the nitrifying bacteria, you give it time to grow, you give it something to feed on. This can either be a fish food. Some people use a sacrificial fish. I typically don't like to use that. They just throw a fish in there, hope it doesn't die, it makes poop, the bacteria eat that poop, or the fish itself dies and they can feed on its body. I typically don't like doing that. I just don't. I would rather just sprinkle in a little bit of food. I think that works perfectly fine. Or alternatively, you can buy like chemically pure, I don't know what I'm saying, but it's like ammonia, it's like a powder, and you just put that right in the tank, and that just pretty much gets to the right direct cause. But I haven't done that myself because I put in, a little bit, and then the tank is cycled, and then I have a giant bottle of ammonia I don't have anything else to do with. So I would just say use a little bit of fish food. You're gonna need it anyway, so go ahead and throw that in the tank. And if this is starting out, you don't have any other tanks to get some bacteria from, it'll probably take upwards of 2 to 3 weeks, depending on the size of the tank. If it's a small tank, I'd say week, 2 weeks, week and a half, probably a good point. You're also going to want some kind of water test kit just to make sure your water is safe. There's strips or there's a big API test kit that you can use that pretty much gives you everything you need. Ammonia, nitrate, pH, pretty much gives you everything you need to know, and I find that's more accurate than the strips. The strips can be a little bit inconsistent, especially with age, and if the method is kind of iffy on how you do it. So I would just say buy some kind of liquid test kit. There's instructions in there. I find those are very accurate and they last a long time. So your tank is cycled and there's no ammonia or nitrite, but there is some nitrates. This is the time where you can finally add fish. So now you have your 10 or 5 gallon tank. you did your research, you figured out what you want. You could get a beta. A single beta would do great in either of those tanks. You can get snails, shrimp, maybe a small school of neons, or some kind of other small schooling fish. Depending on some of those, you might need to buy some kind of lid or use some kind of DIY lid just to keep them from jumping out. That also helps with evaporation. So obviously do your research for each individual fish that you want, because there are fish that like different conditions or like other kinds of hardscape. For instance, like a bristlenose pleco needs driftwood because they gnaw on it to help their digestion, and they just eat it as a source of nutrition. So if you have stuff like that, just make sure you're fitting all those fish needs. I would say a good beginner fish is either a beta or some guppies. They reproduce pretty rapidly, so just be aware of that. But if you have kids, that's something that's really interesting to watch, is watch these betas, or not betas, guppies breed over time, and as their population increases, you might need to find some kind of outlet. Sometimes you can take them to the store you got them from, and they'll exchange them from store credit, or if it's a local fish store, they might be offering to buy them for you if you have nice ones. For a 10-gallon, there might be some species of gourami that are a good fit. Do your own research, figure out what you want, figure out what interests you, because obviously everyone has different interests. I personally am not a big beta fish guy, but there are people out there where their whole thing is betas. They do nothing but breed betas. They have wild type betas. I mean, there's so many different options out there. Just figure out what interests you and just make sure that they're a good fit for your tank. And as time goes on, you can constantly keep adding on. One of the number one things you're going to want to avoid is overstocking, which is when there's too many fish in your aquarium for the tank to be able to process all of that bio load coming from those fish. And also overfeeding. Anything that leads to excess nutrients in the water column is going to be a problem, especially early on when your plants and bacteria colonies haven't grown quite enough to handle that much stress. But something I always think is always add another plant. Like if you have room for plants, add more plants. Plants are wonderful. They're beautiful. They could be a whole hobby on their own. But they ultimately help lower your amount of labor involved. So if you have enough plants, a tank can ultimately become self-sustaining to a point. Like in my 36-gallon, more so it's because of the filters and the amount of fish in there that it is. But I haven't done a water change in there for several months, and I only do water changes when there's something in the tank that tells me it needs water changes, whether that's testing, sick fish aren't looking so hot, algae. Like I don't have algae in any of my tanks really because of well, not no algae. You're always gonna have algae in a tank. Never think you're not gonna have algae in a tank, because there always will be some. It's just part of nature. It's part of that, and it's a sign of a somewhat healthy tank as long as it's not out of line. And they can ultimately help reduce bio load if you're having an emergency in your tank. Like if you're having an emergency in your tank and you have green water, it looks disgusting. It looks like Mountain Dew. So ultimately, the point I'm trying to get here is that algae is a friend. Most of the time, algae is a friend. It's helping you compensate for something that's wrong in your tank. If you have no algae, that's great, but it's also not realistic. So algae is there as just a little helping hand. If you really don't like the look of algae, there's stuff you can do to get rid of it. There's like chemical mixes you can put in there that'll kill algae. I typically don't use those. I think they're just not good for your aquarium. But you can get algae eaters. There's shrimp out there. There's plecos out there. Corydoras, some smaller fish. I think mollies will typically eat some types of algae, but just don't think you're not gonna ever have algae in a tank. It's gonna happen, and ultimately I think it's probably a good thing. I would rather there be algae in a tank than not be algae in a tank, because if you have algae in a tank, it's helping you and it's telling you that life is sustainable within that tank. Also, something you might come across is when a tank's a little bit cloudy. It's kind of like a white cloudy substance in the water column. I'll put up a picture here. That's what's called new tank syndrome, and essentially that's just a bunch of waterborne bacteria that's trying to overcompensate for the bioload. So for the most part, if you test the water and the parameters aren't horrible, I would typically just say let that figure itself out. Don't change that water, because if you change that water, typically what's that going to do is just get rid of the process that's already happening to fix what's in there that's wrong, and you're just going to be resetting that to step one, and it's pretty much just going to do it all over again. So once a tank is stabilized and if you figured out the proper amount of fish in there and the proper amount of feeding to where you're not creating excess amounts of bioload, you don't really need to change your water that much as long as you have a proper amount of plants. And I mean like a good amount of plants. Like you want there to be visibly more plants Like, you want the amount of plants to water to be like a good ratio. Like, don't think one Amazon sword in the back of your tank is going to fix your algae problem or your nitrite problem, because it's not. You need a good amount. You need Java fern on the rocks, you need floating plants, but that stuff's not hard to come by, and for the most part, if you get a good deal, it's not super expensive. Especially as time goes on, plants will start to multiply for you, and ultimately that'll lead to your tank being more sustainable and more healthy in the long run. And the biggest message I want to spread is don't be afraid of a dirty tank. Like, if you have a tank that has soil, that's great. It carries lots of stuff that's going to help your tank thrive over time. Mulm, which is kind of like this brown stuff that builds up over time from decaying plant material and poop and stuff, that is gold. That's like fertilizer. That's like what's keeping your tank alive. And all sorts of microorganisms, if you have shrimp, if you have small fish, they will feed on that, and it will just help continue the cycle of life and what's keeping your aquarium happy and healthy. A super clean tank is an unhealthy tank. If you look at a tank that's pristine and everything's shiny, that tank is going to be way worse at sustaining life than a tank that looks like one of mine, where there's a thin layer of mulm and there's all sorts of movement and life everywhere you look. That super clean tank is what's going to cause new tank syndrome, when that fish is going to die. So my main takeaways for this video are going to be: 1, proper filtration; 2, a proper substrate system; 3, not overstocking and overfeeding; 4, I can't count apparently. 4 is going to be, just take your time. Don't rush anything. You're recreating nature in a box. It's going to take time. It's going to take time to settle in. It's going to take time to become sustainable. I don't know why I'm pointing over there. It's my tank over there. That was a horrible camera angle. Anyway, it's going to be something that takes time, and it's going to settle out on its own for the most part, as long as you're giving the tank what it can handle. If you have lots of plants and not that many fish, and you're not putting in that much food, everything's going to be fine. It's going to take care of itself, and eventually it can be a wonderful experience for you and your loved ones, or if you're by yourself, you know. And the one last point is, do not be afraid of a dirty tank. I mean this as far as in a naturey tank. Like, you look at nature, the water isn't clean. The substrate isn't clean. There's mud everywhere, there's little bits of dirt, there's mulm. So don't expect your tank to be clean. Expect it to look like nature. That's what you want. That's ultimately what we're chasing. And when I say these things, this doesn't apply to everybody. If you want a super clean tank, there's all sorts of stuff. You can get UV sterilizers. You can get lots of stuff to make that tank look as clean and pristine as humanly possible. But this is going to be a simple beginner's guide to how to create a tank that's healthy and simulates nature. Anyway, I hope you learned something today, and I will see you in my next video. Bye-bye.